guys, welcome back to the Get Fit podcast. This is another one of our series in the path of living the happy and healthiest life that we possibly can in the time that we're given on this earth. Today, we're going to be focused on something special. We're going to be talking about brain health. In the past, we've talked about working out. We've talked about eating right. We've talked about mental health. But now I'd like to dig down a little bit deeper, talk about some brain health and about Alzheimer's. I have some friends with me today. I've got Laura Buhman. She is the walk manager. She is actually located in St. Joe right now. And I've also got Jeremy Koerber, and he's the program manager for the St. Louis region, and he's out of St. Louis. So we have St. Joe, we've got Sedalia, we've got St. Louis on the call today. So welcome, everyone.
Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So Laura, tell us a little bit about what you do with the Alzheimer's Association.
Well, as a walk manager, I help to schedule and plan and recruit people to walk with our Walk to End Alzheimer's. The walk happens in about 600 communities across the country, and they raise dollars to support the programs and services that we offer that are free to all of our community members. And so what I do is help to raise those dollars by recruiting teams and finding sponsors, and those dollars then help Jeremy do his job.
Okay. Very good. So Jeremy, explain a little bit about what you do, sir.
Yeah, so what I am mainly responsible for is helping to put education programs into our community. That we also then try to start linking the education as somewhat of a funnel that will then get people to support groups or early stage programming or care consultations. And then ultimately, we like to keep this in the family. So a lot of times what ends up happening is a family will work with us, and then they're so moved, they're so touched by the experience, they stay with us and end up doing things like working with Laura in walk teams and things like that. So it's kind of a neat circular motion, but my role really is to get into the community and start getting people to have conversations. Mm-hmm. Ultimately what I do.
Absolutely. And that's a big part. You're talking about, Jeremy, you talk about conversations. There's Alzheimer's and brain health. The brain controls every function that we do. However, it's so not understood of really how everything works. And really Alzheimer's, there's probably not a lot of people that are going to be listening to this podcast that Alzheimer's really hasn't affected them, their family, or some loved one that they know. It affects nearly every family in there. Explain to me a little bit about what Alzheimer's is.
Well, first off, let's talk about what it isn't. All right, it's not normal, and I think that's one of the things that we really, I wouldn't say struggle, but it's always such an eye-opening experience when we talk to people and they just make the automatic assumption that as I get older or as mom gets older, this is in the cards. And that's no. It's a degenerative brain disease. Nerve cells are dying. And there's a lot of reasons potentially why that happens. And again, to loop it back into brain health, there's also a lot of things we're learning now that could be a risk reduction or a preventative tool. But ultimately, if you look at it, that I always use the example, and I don't have one with me right here, but if I was going to take a pen with a clicker and just start going back and forth, just that simple motion right there, mm-hmm. Think about the messages that are firing at speeds that are unfathomable. When brain cells start to die, those messages slow down, okay? Then you start to see the changes, the memory, the behaviors, and that's ultimately what is happening. If you look at it as it's a muscle and that muscle atrophies, that's how you need to look at it. There's the brain today, 15 years from now, there's the brain. And so that's kind of in a very non-science-y way how I would describe that process.
Okay. Why are some people more prone to it? Because it is, I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it is inherited. Alzheimer's in families are kind of inherited. What is it that makes some people, they can be 100 years old and still not see any effects of it? And then sometimes it can show up in some early stages of, 40, 50 years old.
It's a great question. So you have what's called a risk gene, and then there's what's called deterministic genes. So risk genes, if mom and dad and grandma and grandpa all had diabetes, you probably have what's called a risk gene. that means that you're probably susceptible to that. But here's what I want people to understand who are listening to this, because I've been a personal trainer for 25 years, and I've seen what we call the blueprint for healthy aging can do. And so what I'm getting at is there's people that exercise and eat right that still will get diabetes. But I always ask that question, would they have gotten it at 42 instead of 72? And that's where this stuff kind of comes into play. I can't promise if you eat well, exercise, engaging in cognitive exercises like puzzles and games and continuous learning, that you won't get dementia at some point. But maybe grandma got it at 65, maybe mom got it at 64. Well, maybe you don't get it till 85 because of what you've done. And I think that's how you have to look at it, is that at the end of the day, we can't promise that you're going to get more years in life, but you might get more life in years. And at the end, if you can push that back a little bit. So that's what I would describe as a risk gene. Deterministic is more or less thinking in terms of like when you're like early onset. You see it coming, it's generational, and it's not happening at 65 or 70 or 75. It's happening at like 52. That's where, and there's a lot of research being poured into that aspect right there. That's a different ball game altogether. I would almost liken that, if we were going to have parallels, to kind of like, and I can't remember the exact letters and numbers for that gene, but like with the breast cancer gene that says, hey, it's not a matter of how you're at risk, it's a matter of you will get this. And that's kind of how I want you to look at those two. But what we know, and this is something that we talk about in our healthy living program, is that environment, and I'm not talking about, water and trees. I'm talking about, what you live in and do, and your lifestyle is wildly important. So if that's kind of the messaging that we're trying, and we are trying to do that, because Alzheimer's, if you look at and Lars is aware of this, if you look at the trends of how much this is going to cost and what they're estimating the number of people to have this over the next 10, 15, 20 years, wow, if we could reverse that trend and really get people focusing on not just exercise for diabetes, or you should, let's lose a few pounds because the doctor said so. Hey, let's look at this from even a more global standpoint of how it could impact your brain. They want us to work till 67. That's Social Security. Okay.
Yeah.
How about we do some things now that might, give us some more of that? And that's one of the messages that we're going to send when it comes to brain health.
Jeremy, you brought some of that was kind of interesting. How are you seeing the trend? Are there more and more Alzheimer's diagnosis? Any comparatively? Is it going this way, or is it kind of flat? How? And if so, if it is increasing, what are the reasons that it's getting there's more and more cases out there?
A great question. I don't know that I have the answer for that today. I think what tends to happen, and now I'm just guessing along the way here. It's kind of like, if we were to, like in anything else, I mean, you might even be able to extrapolate some stuff from the pandemic. How many cases were there versus how many cases of people that didn't go to the doctor? When you're talking about from a diagnostic perspective, are more people getting diagnosed? Well, that's going to ramp that number up as well. So I'm not saying that there's that number of people out there now, but as we, it's always said in a wellness program, when you start getting people to go to the doctor, you're going to see an uptick in expenses, because now you've got sick people that are learning that they're sick.
Yeah.
Right. Then you can start to put in some tactics, strategies, modalities, if you want to call it that, to work on those things. So that's what the trends are going with right now. I think, with the right messaging, and we're always trying to reach new markets. If we were able to now get the message, cardiovascular health, they bang the drum on that all the time. Diabetes management, they bang the drum on that all the time. If we could now start talking about brain health in the same or inside the same parameters, I wonder, would you start to see, again, this is a theory, would you start to see, instead of it climbing, would you see maybe a lesser of a climb, maybe a little flatter? I don't know the answer to that, but I have to believe, after watching people throughout my career who have aged well, there is a very precise blueprint that when you look at what they do, they might be doing it slightly different, but it's the same 4 or 5 tactics across the board. And it's remarkable. And back when I started this, there was no science to really support that. Mm-hmm. Now there's science to support, hey, if you do these things, there's a really good chance that we may be able to prevent some bad stuff from happening down the line.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Laura.
I think that's a key thing, is how much more we know now. I mean, my grandfather was diagnosed when he was in his early 70s, and that was in the 90s. And compared to he lived with the disease for over 20 years. But what we know now about the disease and how it develops and how it changes behaviors and the symptoms that are associated with it, the treatment, when you know something earlier on and you recognize signs earlier, then you can take steps to prepare for what's coming. And also you look at the numbers of population. I mean, we've got a huge baby boomer population that is right now in that high risk age group. Well, when you have a high number of people in a risk group, those numbers are going to go up. And as populations change, those numbers will be, responding to that. But also in the future, we will know even more than we know now because of the research that we're doing now. Now, that could increase diagnoses right there just because we're able to recognize things sooner. When you were talking about earlier, you said something about spatial. I think that was one of the first things that happened with my grandpa. I was in high school and I would go with my grandpa to the football games, with my aunt and my grandpa to the football games at the local high school. And I would go up to my grandma and grandpa's house to ride with them. And I got in the car, in the back seat, opened the door, got in the car, and I didn't get the back door shut. And grandpa backed out of the garage with the door open. And the door, got damaged, but he wasn't diagnosed with his Alzheimer's for another probably 8 years. But those kinds of things started happening more frequently. Those fender benders, that was an earlier sign that we probably didn't realize was happening because we didn't know to look for those things. Right. But now we know that if those kinds of things are happening more frequently, then that means that there's probably a problem.
Exactly.
But you just think, like Jeremy said, you just think he's just getting older. He's not paying attention. He's distracted. You make all kinds of excuses. My grandpa was a farmer. Sometimes he would leave in his truck to go work on a fence somewhere, and he would disappear for like hours. Well, that's normal in a farm situation. Your grandpa goes and works for 3 or 4 hours and then comes back for lunch. Sometimes he wasn't coming back.
Yeah.
And then when you'd find him, when like my dad, we were next door neighbors, my dad would go look for him, and he wouldn't be where he said he was going to be. And then when you ask him what he's doing, he doesn't really know what he was doing. He couldn't answer that question. He would climb on top of the garage with the ladder to work on the roof, or on top of the barn to work on the roof. But the damage that was done to the roof was like a few years ago, and that damage had already been repaired. But he was telling you, I was fixing the shingles from the storm we had that storm was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Those were, and after more, you recognize that those are signs. But in the moment, if you don't have that information, then you don't realize that's what's happening. And so what Jeremy and I are trying to do as a team, I'm raising funds and awareness, and he's trying to educate people so that if you have family members that start to show those signs, you know what the signs are.
Absolutely. You mentioned, Jeremy, about some tactics, some preventative tactics. You said that you had 4 or 5 points. What are some of the tactics that are out there right now?
So the things that we talk most about in our healthy living program are exercise, nutrition, cognitive exercise, and socialization. So, what we always pitch is that what's good for the brain is good for the body, and vice versa. Okay, so aerobic exercise seems to be the big winner. However, if you like lifting weights, lift weights. If you like yoga,
do yoga.
From a nutrition standpoint, this is where, when we give that program, I always try to talk about it from 2 phases. One is strategic. Here's what you should be eating. Here's what you shouldn't be. We know those things. So now it's trying to help people get really tactical, because most diets fail. We know that. What do we start with? And that's kind of like I would say maybe almost a personalized conversation, but we can get the conversation started. And then, if we need to talk to a dietitian or things like that, that's something that we can refer out to. Cognitive exercise, that's the bicep curl for the brain. All right. Games, learning, and then socialization is just that, being around people. The two other elements that come with this are going to be sleep and smoking cessation. So what the studies show, and my numbers are slightly off here, but good enough. If you were to deploy 4 of the 6 tactics, that's a 59% reduction in risk for dementia. If you're like, hey, I don't want to do all 6, well, okay, well, you do 3. And maybe that 3 doesn't even include exercise. I hate exercise. I don't want to sweat. Fine. Pick 3. You can reduce it by as much as 39%. And so, for a lot of people, that can be overwhelming. So what I try to do, and we did this with our last Sweat for the Brain campaign, and we're going to do it with another session coming up soon, is, hey, let's think about exercise and cognitive exercise and socialization. Think about this. If you go to a Zumba class, I can't dance, but you go to a Zumba class, you're getting exercise.
Yep.
You're probably going to be there with a bunch of friends. Now you're getting socialization.
Yep.
I can't dance to save my life. So I've got to think about where my feet are going to go and how I'm going. Now you're doing that cognitive,
yep.
And then you want to argue that there's no nutrition there. Fine. You and your friends, when Zumba's done, go down the street and get a smoothie. You've knocked all of them out right there. So I don't want to make it so we don't
overwhelming.
In front of that. Overwhelming. Yeah. That's a great word. So we try to help people understand that what you're already doing maybe is great. If you're already doing those things, keep doing those things. And if you're not, let's talk about some other, again, tactics, strategies to kind of get that going there, because, getting that habit formed is the most important thing. But here's the exciting thing for me. I was doing some continuing education a month ago for my personal training certification. I'm an exercise physiologist through the American College of Sports Medicine.
Okay.
And I'm going through my continuing education. They've always listed the benefits of exercise, risk reduction for diabetes, management of high blood pressure, all that stuff. You know what's on there now? Reduction in the risk for dementia. Yes. So it's there. It's proven. So when you're talking about brain health, if that's the message for today, that's something that I need people to understand is now it's not it might. When an organization like the ACSM will put their stamp on it, now it's, hey, this is real. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. Those are all great things. Laura, you talked a little bit about some of the signs that you've seen in your grandpa over the years, and after it took you really 8 years before the diagnosis. And honestly, if we and you guys are doing your part to help build awareness and educate and of course build funds for the research of it. But what are some of the things now that we can look for in ourselves, or not really ourselves, but our friends, our family, our parents, our grandparents? What are some of the signs that we can look for right now that are, okay, we're noticing this is different? When is it time for us to start taking action?
Well, Jeremy, do you want to speak to what the signs are and the taking steps? I know that you can also recognize symptoms in yourself. A lot of people think that the signs that they're seeing are just what happens when you get older. Mm-hmm. But what I like about some of the stuff that we talk about through the Alzheimer's Association, we talk about you've lost your keys and you can't remember where you put your keys. But if you have dementia, you won't find your keys. Right. If you're a normal aging person, you can trace back your steps, like physically. I got home from the grocery store and I came in the house and I went straight to the bathroom. And then they walk straight to the bathroom and they look and their keys aren't there. And they go, okay, where did I go after the bathroom? Okay, I went into the living room to hang up my coat. A normal aging person can still trace back their steps. But a person who has dementia, it's like that path's not even there anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's a great one. We talked about the spatial awareness, and not even spatial, but also color. I mean, you think about red lights, green lights. I mean, the brain is not processing information like it did. That's one. The farming example, I think, is great because, decreased or poor judgment. I mean, when you're working on top of a barn or with power equipment, you know, hay binds, things like that, where once dad or grandpa used to use all the safety equipment, now they're cutting corners. That's, to me, that's a big sign right there. You know, even if you're doing stuff like running a chainsaw or things like that, there's things that you're supposed to do, and now they're not. Big red flag. Yesterday, I can't remember who gave this example, but it was great. You know, not paying bills. We all forget to pay a bill once in a while, but all of a sudden, your electricity goes off, and you're sitting there in the dark, and you don't understand why the electricity went off. Well, you go back and you look, and all of a sudden that bill hasn't been paid for 6 months. I mean, there are very, you know, kind of, and like Laura said, if you're not looking for them in the beginning, you may glance over them, but once you start to see them, you're going to be sitting there and they're going to say something, and you're going to say, okay, well, that's kind of odd. And then you start to notice a second and a third and a fourth, and all of a sudden, I always say the red flag starts to go up. And that's really where, at that point, we still aren't diagnosing things. But that's why we call this warning signs. It's a conversation starter to say, and I'm kind of going through this right now with some family members as well. You know, let's have the conversation, either as a family or with a doctor, because there are some very important reasons why you want to have an earlier diagnosis. These are the things we want to do now. Most people are really scared of what this might mean.
Exactly.
And yeah, they're petrified of it, and I get it. But for us to help the individual, for their healthcare team to help the individual, for any partner that's out there, sooner the better. So like with my grandmother, I'll give you an example. They hid her signs and symptoms as much as they could until she was well down the road. And by that point, she wasn't able to be a part of her care planning. You know, now it made it more difficult for any legal or financial or power of attorneys. There's a lot of a mess right there. And so the earlier that we can get on it, the better. The medications that we have to treat the symptoms they work better.
Absolutely.
Earlier. Okay, so there's a whole myriad of reasons why. And I guess what I would say, I mean, Laura, you can chime in this too. People are going to go to a hospital today in any town or city across this country, and they're going to be given a diagnosis. I had a friend of mine the other week. His mother was given a diagnosis of 6 months. Okay, that's awful, scary. How long did your grandfather live with Alzheimer's?
Over 20 years.
Over 20 years. Now, we all know the end is terrible, but the end is terrible with any type of chronic or debilitative disease like that. But what I want to say is that if you're diagnosed early and you get your affairs in order, we're not putting money into the 401k now. Now we're living for right now.
Yep.
And that's important, because there are some people that we've worked with through the association who have now become advocates. They're living with the disease, and they are taking that news, and they've created a silver lining with it. They've shown that the face of Alzheimer's isn't necessarily what we might think it is. And that's also pretty empowering right there, when you can take something like that and turn it into a positive. And that's really where a lot of the stories that come from the walks really kind of rise up to the top right there, is that, you know, again, it ends the same.
Yeah.
Okay, we know that.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, the end is the end, but there's stuff that can be done that
and
really.
What's the quality of life that you want during that time?
Absolutely.
So with my grandpa as an example, we were seeing signs not knowing that's what they were. That was hindsight. But, you know, into the 90s, when I moved away, and so I would come back, and then people started to talk about what was happening with grandpa. And I know that they started to identify it, but he did not receive a diagnosis for quite a few years. but the conversations started to happen between my dad. My dad's the oldest of 10 kids.
Oh.
So the conversation started to happen with him and his brothers and sisters and my grandma and my grandpa, because he was coherent and he understood that something was happening and that he wasn't always aware that it was happening, but that it was happening, so that they could start to make arrangements, because my grandparents owned a farm. They had to, you don't want this to be devastating to your family. And if you can find this information out, you can start to make plans. So my grandparents put their farm in an irrevocable trust, and the family dollars were in an irrevocable trust, and my dad was an executor, and his sister was the second executor, and then my uncle was the medical, like their medical go-to person. They all took on different responsibilities, but that planning couldn't have happened if we ignored it or pushed it back or hid the problems. And I think grandma compensated for him for years before we even realized it was happening. She was taking care of things without even realizing she was taking care of things. But once we recognized that there was definitely a problem, even before he had an actual official diagnosis, because in the 90s, it took time. Like, you had to go and get a scan. It just seemed like that process took years to get to the diagnosis. But once they knew.
How is it different now, Laura, with that was the 90s, we're in 2021. Is the diagnosis process a lot different now? Is it a quicker thing? And is there a cure? Is there a cure, or is there gonna be a cure? And if there is, what can we do to make that happen?
Well, I think that we definitely have more educated doctors and processes and structures in place to recognize. I have an uncle who is a PhD in psychology, and one of his main jobs at the local hospital system is to do these evaluations. He gives psychiatric evaluations to identify whether they are having cognitive dementia-like symptoms. It's things like asking about clocks and time and words, but that's, in the 90s, just trying to find someone to give him a test to see if he was having, back then I think they asked him 5 questions or 10 questions, and now it's like a multi-level process to go through. But now that we know more and there's structures there's doctors and people who are informed and educated, things move more quickly. But it takes the initiative of the family, or because sometimes the person who has the disease doesn't recognize they have the disease, or they're in denial, or people that are right there with them. I have a cousin, her daughter lives far away and her son lives far away, but her husband lives with her, and he's seeing all these behaviors, but the kids don't want to move on it because they think he's just making it up. But they came to stay with them for a week, and they saw the severe behavior changes, and then they knew it was real, and then they can help to move forward. So, that, I think that's like a critical step that we play a part in, because we're trying to help educate people so that they know what to do next and who to go to and what those signs are. There's not a cure. We aren't there yet. That's what we're fighting for. That's what we're doing all of our research for. But we hope to get there, because none of us want to see families suffer like this.
Absolutely not. And that's where Jeremy comes into play is, okay, now we know what's going on. How do we, what are some things out there? And so you're the liaison between them, the family, and this disease. There's information and courses and things out there that you can help them with. And we can't be afraid. We can't be afraid of the disease. It's a lot of people say, ignorance is bliss. You start seeing it. Okay, well, let's not think about it. And that's not a cure. That's not helping anybody out. It's about talking, and you guys said it this whole podcast. Let's talk about it. Let's bring awareness to it. And Laura, this is what you do. Let's talk a little bit about what the walk is and why you're doing it, and what entails the walk.
Well, what we're trying to do with the walk is bring people together and give them a sense of belonging, that they aren't alone in this fight. Most of the people that come to our walks are people who have been impacted. These are people who have a sibling, a parent, a grandparent, or even themselves who have been through this process, and they want to walk in honor of that person. They want to walk in memory of that person. We have different colored flowers. I don't know if you can see them behind me. Each of the colors means something different. I walk for the purple flower because I lost someone to the disease. If you carry a yellow flower, you're caring for someone with the disease. If you carry the blue, which you can't kind of see, it's all the back there, the blue flower means you're living with the disease. And if you carry the orange flower, maybe you haven't had a direct person in your life, family, friend, that's been impacted by the disease, but you care about the mission and you care about the people and you want to help fight the fight.
Absolutely.
And so, we are bringing awareness, bringing people together so they're not alone. We have a sense of community. We missed out on that so much last year without the walks. So this year we get to go back to having in-person walks.
Good.
If everything, keep your fingers crossed, the pandemic continues to be going in the decline and people are getting vaccinated and we're feeling safer being together. Hopefully by September, everyone will feel really good and we're going to be in person walking at Centennial Park on September 11th.
Centennial Park. September 11th is the date?
September 11th at Centennial Park.
And when can teams start signing up? Because I know I always put a team in through we try to sponsor it through the newspaper here. We do that every year, but we also put our own little team in and try to raise funds with that. And that's fun. That's we kind of go against. There's a realtor company in town that we're always back and forth with on funds raised. And there's a few people, some of my friends in the community here, that I actually just went to the park this afternoon, had lunch, and she was there, and her and I chit-chatted and let her know I was doing this podcast this afternoon. But it is, how can people get involved? When does this all start to take place? And what are some other information we should know about the upcoming walk?
Well, they can get registered at any time. I can give you the link. It's alz.org/Sedalia Walk.
Sedalia Walk, okay.
That's where you go to sign up your team. You've already got your team in existence, but each year you have to restart your team, get that re-registration done, and then contact your people to get signed up with your team. If you are starting a brand new team, you just go to that site and you just click new team, and then you start to talk to your family, your friends, people you go to church with, people you go to maybe you're in Rotary, you go to Rotary group, anybody that you work with, ask them to join your team, and then they can help do some fundraising to help raise dollars to support the programs and the support groups and the education events that we have. And then we get together and we all walk, and that's quite an experience, just being together and seeing so many other people who are sharing that have gone through this same process. And then we just we celebrate once we complete that, and then we pick up and do it again the next year.
Absolutely. And so the walk it does three things that Jeremy said. One, it socializes.
Yep.
Number two, it's only a mile walk, or I don't know for sure. It's right around a mile walk. So it's exercise. You're out doing something healthy. And three, it builds awareness and some cognitive thinking with it. So Jeremy, before we sign off here, what are some of the resources that people can that are out there for them if they have any questions about themselves or a loved one that might be battling this disease? What's their next step?
Our website's pretty robust. All right. So if you go to the alz.org, you are going to, there's a lot of places to go. We have what's called the Community Resource Finder on there, and we can get some links for you for post-show notes on that. But the neat thing about the Community Resource Finder, and it's a little different right now, but as we start to get back in person, you can go on, you can hit education programs, and then you can select between education, support group, early stage. You can plug in your zip code or your town, and it's going to pull up within a 25 to 50 mile radius of what we have going on all around there.
Okay.
So if someone would like to, learn more, there's an opportunity. If they're already in that journey, maybe they're looking for an early stage program, opportunity. If a caregiver is looking for support, opportunity. And so I think another just important component as well, see, we learned some things in this pandemic because up to this point, everything we did was in person.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found out was that's not a necessity. So there will continue to be virtual support groups, virtual early stage program for people with the disease, and virtual educations that will continue on, because what we're learning is some people like the Zoom. And so it works. And so we'll have both in person and virtual experiences for people ongoing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep. I'm typing in just a few things. I want to make sure and share our 24-hour helpline for people who are starting to have some questions, and families that are living with someone with dementia. Your problems don't happen between the hours of 8 and 5. I know with my grandfather, he would be up in the middle of the night, and 2 and 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning was when a lot of different things happened that were impactful. So this 800 number is for people to call at any time of day or night, and they can talk to a dementia care specialist who will then help them answer that question, or at least put them in contact with someone who can answer that question.
And what's that number offhand? Because what we'll do here, gang, is on our YouTube link here, we're going to go ahead and put that contact information that you've mentioned before. That way they can link right to that.
Okay.
What's that telephone number, Laura?
It's 1-800-272-3900.
Okay.
So it's 1-800-272-3900.
Okay. And what was the website one more time?
For the walk, to register for walk.
For ALS and also for the walk.
Well, for just general information, alz.org, and then to register for walk, alz.org, and then /Sedalia walk.
Sedalia walk. Very excited about that. Well, gang, I sure appreciate you guys. Oh, go ahead, Laura.
Well, I was going to say, Jeremy, I think, shared our communityresourcefinder.org. That's also very, very helpful for identifying support groups and programs and education events that are around your zip code.
Okay, very good. Very good. Well, again, I appreciate you guys taking time out of your schedule. This was something that was, pretty important to us, and we wanted to make sure that we sit there and we get out here and we talk a little bit about it. A half an hour podcast is not enough to talk about everything there is with Alzheimer's. But what we did get out of it is, one, there's resources out there for you guys. You're not fighting this battle all by yourself. Number two, there's ways to support this cause, and that is with the walks that happen. There's walk in our community. There's a walk in a lot of communities out there. So if you're listening to this outside of Sedalia, see if there is a walk in your area and participate and get your friends and family out there. But Jeremy, hit one thing that I wanted to point out before we go here is you said some of the things that help slow the progression of this disease it's not rocket science. It's eating healthy. It's exercising. It's socialization. These things that you've talked about are not only good for the brain, but they're good for the entire body and every mental, physical, emotional, spiritual health. This is important to keep your health up front and make it a priority. Get plenty of sleep, eat right. Because it might not affect you today or it might not affect you tomorrow, but along the lines, at some point in time, it's going to affect you. So, right. Well, gang, before we sign off, is there anything else you guys wanted to mention to our listeners today?
Well, I wanted to say thank you to you and all of the people at the Sedalia Democrat for walking with us every year. We really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Anything we can do. Yeah. Jeremy?
I love talking health and fitness. So, yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, very good, guys. So we'll go ahead and get out of here. Again, this is Will with the Sedalia Democrat and the Get Fit Challenge, and I'm challenging you to get fit.